It was the night of our third anniversary party, a lavish affair in full swing, when I saw my husband Ethan Sterling entangled with another woman in the quiet of our home's wine cellar. He had no idea I was standing there frozen in the narrow gap of the doorway. I dug my nails into the wooden frame so hard I felt the sting of blood, desperately swallowing the scream that clawed its way up my throat. The woman was Vanessa Thorne, the company's new VP of sales. A woman with sharp features and eyes that could burn through steel. But it wasn't her beauty that scorched me. It was every single word of their conversation, each one a poisoned needle piercing my heart. Vanessa purred, her voice sweet as honey, but laced with a viper's venom. "How much longer are you going to keep that plain Jane wife of yours around? I hate sneaking around like this." Ethan chuckled. A laugh I once found charming now sounded utterly repulsive. He pulled her waist in his voice arrogant. "What's the rush? The woman can't even pop out a kid. My mother will take care of kicking her out soon enough. I'm only keeping her around for appearances to keep my father off my back. Once I have a firm grip on my inheritance, you'll be the mistress of this house." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Can't even pop out a kid. For the last 3 years, I had tormented myself with guilt, choked down countless supplements, and shuttled between the offices of endless specialists. Was it all just to hear those words from the man I had loved with my entire being? I turned and walked away like a sleepwalker. The party outside was still loud, laughter, conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses. It all sounded like noise from another world. I went straight to our bedroom, locked the door, and sank to the floor. The tears wouldn't come, but my chest ached as if someone had reached in and was squeezing my heart with their bare hands. How long had I been sitting there? Ethan returned, reeking of expensive scotch and Vanessa's cheap perfume. He saw me on the floor and without a word of concern said with an annoyed sigh, "Why do you always have that funeral face on? It's such a downer." I lifted my head, looked him straight in the eye, and asked in a cracked voice, "Where were you?" Ethan flinched for a second before his arrogant mask slipped back on. "Entertaining guests." "Why do you need to know?" I stood up and walked toward him, each step feeling as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "In the wine cellar." "Funny that guest smells exactly like Vanessa Thorne." The color drained from Ethan's face. He stared at me, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "Were you following me?" I let out a bitter laugh, a twisted smile that was more painful than crying. "I don't need to follow the filthy things you two do. The stench follows you." The next moment, a sharp crack echoed in the room as a searing pain erupted on my cheek. Ethan roared, "Who the hell do you think you're talking to? Let me make this clear. I'm sick of your miserable face. For 3 years, you haven't been able to do the one thing you're supposed to. What right do you have to raise your voice in this house?" Just then, the door burst open. It was my mother-in-law, Victoria Sterling. Seeing the scene before her, she didn't spare me a single glance, instead rushing to Ethan's side and stroking his arm. "What's all this commotion, dear?" Ethan pointed a finger at me, his voice dripping with venom. "Mother, look at this. She's accusing me of having an affair." Victoria turned to me, her eyes as cold as a winter lake. "And do you have proof? Or are you just making a scene based on some petty jealousy?" I clutched my burning cheek, and only then did the tears finally fall. I saw it with my own 2 eyes, Mother. Victoria's lips curled into a contemptuous smile. "And what if you did men make a mistake or two? You're the wife. A wife's duty is to know her place, to turn a blind eye, and live with it. You can't even fulfill the most basic obligation of providing an heir for this family. What gives you the right to police your husband?" Her every word was a sledgehammer crashing down on my head. I looked at the woman before me, the person I had spent 3 years trying to serve and please, and I realized in her eyes I had never been a person. I was a tool, a baby-making machine, and a broken one at that. "So you're saying I should just accept all of this?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage. "And what if you don't? Are you going to divorce him?" Victoria scoffed. "And do what? If you walk out of this house with nothing, what will you have? You'll be nothing but an aging, broke, childless woman. Listen carefully. If Miss Thorne gets pregnant with a son first, there's no guarantee your position as the lady of this house will remain." Standing beside them, Ethan crossed his arms, looking down at me with a triumphant smirk. In that moment, I no longer felt pain. The pain had morphed into something cold and sharp. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. I looked at the mother and son standing there, like victors reveling in my agony, and a dark, wild thought crossed my mind. A divorce. No, that's too easy for them. Leave with nothing. Absolutely not. I would not go anywhere. I would stay right here in this hell. And I would make the ones who trampled me pay the ultimate price. I would take from them what they cherished most, what they were most proud of. My gaze drifted to a family photo on the dresser. My father-in-law, Richard Sterling, the most powerful man in this family. He always wore a stern expression, but sometimes he would look at me with an unreadable glint in his eyes. He was the only one in this house who had never berated me about my infertility. A cold, cruel voice echoed in my head. It was my own. Ethan, you want a son, to carry on the family name and inherit your fortune. Fine. I will give this house a male heir. But you won't be the father. I will make you raise your own father's son your entire life thinking he's yours. I will turn that child into the sweetest, most brutal weapon of my revenge. As the insane plan took shape, a tremor ran through my body. It wasn't from fear. It was from a devilish thrill. I gave the mother and son one last look and silently turned away. My war had just begun. After that fateful night, I was no longer the person I had been. The obedient wife, the long-suffering daughter-in-law, that woman was dead. All that remained in this body was a vessel for a cruel revenge, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator patiently waiting for its moment. I didn't cause a scene, I didn't cry, and I no longer accused Ethan. The next morning, I woke up early as usual and prepared breakfast for the family. My cheek was still slightly swollen, but I concealed it with a thin layer of makeup. As I set the table, Ethan and Victoria watched me with suspicion, likely surprised by my composure. I simply offered a faint, empty smile. I'm sorry about last night. I must have misunderstood, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. Ethan looked stunned and Victoria narrowed her eyes, trying to see through me. As long as you know your place, she said coldly and dropped the subject. I knew they thought I had surrendered, that I had accepted my fate, terrified of a future where I would be thrown out with nothing. They were wrong. This wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic retreat to hunt a tiger. First, you must lower the tiger's guard. And the tiger I was after was not Ethan, but the most powerful beast in this jungle, my father-in-law, Richard Sterling. Even in his late 50s, he was a commanding presence. As the chairman of a massive real estate development group, his word in this house was law. He was a man of few words, and an intimidating aura radiated from him. Ethan's entire position was thanks to his father's shadow. But I knew that deep down, Richard was profoundly disappointed in his son. I had often heard him sigh while reviewing the performance reports from the subsidiary Ethan managed. I had seen him shake his head as Ethan proudly recounted his nights of debauchery. Richard Sterling was a man who had dedicated his life to his work, and he craved a worthy successor to inherit the empire he'd built. The philandering, incompetent Ethan was certainly not that man. This was his weakness, and it would be my bait. I began to change. I no longer wasted my time tending to Ethan. Instead, I poured my energy into studying my father-in-law's world. I read every business journal, meticulously followed real estate market trends, and educated myself on every project his group undertook. I knew he had a habit of reading the Wall Street Journal in his study every morning while drinking tea. I started waking up even earlier, brewing the rare oolong tea he favored, and placing it neatly on his desk before he came down. At first he said nothing, merely giving me a passing glance. But I didn't let it discourage me, quietly repeating the ritual every day. Then one morning as I set down the teapot, he suddenly spoke. You know about tea. I was startled but quickly regained my composure. Not an expert, sir, but I've read this blend is good for one's health and helps clear the mind. Richard nodded and took a sip. You're not wrong. He opened the financial paper and I saw him pause at an article analyzing new trends in construction materials. I took a risk. Sir, I read that article yesterday. The analysis on the potential of using composite materials in high-rise buildings was quite insightful. Not only are they lighter and stronger, but they could significantly reduce foundation load cutting, costs considerably. Richard lifted his head and looked at me. This time, his eyes held not indifference but a flicker of surprise. You're interested in this sort of thing? Yes. I had some free time and did a little reading. I figured since I'm part of the family, I should know something about the family business, I said humbly. He said nothing more, but I knew I had planted the first seed in his mind. I had shown him I was not just a woman confined to the kitchen. I had a mind and an interest in his world. From that day on, our brief conversations in the study became more frequent. Sometimes it was a comment on the news, other times a few thoughts on the economy. I always maintained a learning posture, asking intelligent questions and offering fresh perspectives that made him think. Gradually, he began to open up to me. He spoke of the struggles of his early days, the fierce competitors in the market, and his anguish over Ethan. That boy Ethan, he said one morning with a sigh. All style, no substance. All he thinks about is partying. Every time I give him a responsibility, someone else has to clean up his mess. I don't know what will become of this company I've spent my life building. I silently refilled his cup, but inside I was cheering. He was beginning to see me as a confidant. Ethan just lacks motivation, I think, I said carefully. Perhaps with greater responsibility or a turning point in his life, he might change. Richard gave a bitter smile. Responsibility, I gave him an entire subsidiary to run, and all he's produced is debt. At this point, I'm just hoping he has a child soon. Maybe a son would make him grow up. His words were an arrow that hit the bullseye of my plan. A son. That was what he wanted, and I would be the one to give it to him. But I had to do it naturally, masterfully. Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa's affair grew more blatant. They no longer met secretly in the wine cellar, but went out for dinner and movies openly. Ethan even bought her an expensive foreign sports car. My mother-in-law knew everything but pretended not to. She even remarked to me casually, "That Miss Thorne has a fortunate look about her, like she could bear a strong son." Every word from Victoria, every action from Ethan was a knife twisting in my gut. But at the same time, it was fuel driving me faster down the path of my revenge. One evening, Ethan came home completely drunk, a bright red lipstick stain on his collar. He threw his car keys on the table and yelled at me, "Get me some lemonade." I silently complied. As I handed him the glass, he swatted it from my hand, sending it crashing to the floor. "Is this how you do things? Can't even do one simple thing right." Without a word, I quietly got a cloth and began to clean up the mess. Just then, my father-in-law came down the stairs. He saw the scene and his face hardened. "Ethan, what do you think you're doing?" His commanding voice seemed to sober Ethan up instantly. "It was an accident, Dad. I just spilled it." "An accident? Or were you coming home drunk and harassing your wife?" Richard walked over and stared Ethan down. "Look at yourself. Do you look like a responsible man? Neglecting the company, drinking day and night, chasing women? Do you have any idea how you're embarrassing me?" Ethan hung his head, unable to say a word. Victoria rushed out to defend him. "Richard the boy is just tired from work and had a few drinks." "You stay out of this," Richard roared. "It's because you've coddled him his whole life that he's turned out like this." Then he turned to me, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Claire, you go on up and rest. Don't mind him." I looked up at him. For a moment, I saw a flicker of protectiveness, of validation in his eyes. I gave a small nod and turned to leave. But as I passed him, I deliberately stumbled, feigning a loss of balance. Instinctively, Richard reached out and caught my arm. Careful. His skin was warm, his hand strong and steady. I lifted my head, looked him directly in the eyes, and said in a trembling voice, "Thank you, sir." In that instant, our gazes locked. It was only for a few seconds, but I knew something invisible had sparked between us. I was no longer just his daughter-in-law. In his eyes, I was a wronged woman, an ally, someone who could understand his heart. The biggest fish in the pond was starting to show interest in my bait, and I knew before long he would bite. The incident that night was like a stone thrown into a still lake, creating invisible but persistent ripples between my father-in-law and me. Nothing was the same. The way he looked at me now held something different, an interest that went beyond the typical father-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. He no longer addressed me formally as you, but occasionally used my name. "Claire, could you bring me the paper?" His low, warm voice sometimes sounded so gentle it startled me. I knew the path I was walking was dangerous and sinful, but every time I saw Ethan and Vanessa's triumphant faces or Victoria's contemptuous glare, the fire of revenge in me burned hotter, consuming all hesitation and fear. I had to keep going. I had to see it through to the end. I began to create more opportunities for us to accidentally cross paths. I knew he had a habit of taking a walk in the estate's garden for a late afternoon break. I started going to the garden around that time, sometimes pruning the roses, other times watering the prized orchids he cared for. We started having longer conversations. He spoke not only of work but also of his youth and his ambitions. I realized that behind that cold, authoritative exterior was a rather lonely soul. My mother-in-law, Victoria, was a woman who chased material possessions and status. She was more interested in social galas and expensive luxury goods than her husband's inner world. His only son, Ethan, was a great disappointment. I became the only person in this house who would sit quietly and listen to him. "You know, I once dreamed of being an architect," he said one day, looking out at the sunset. "I wanted to design magnificent buildings with my own hands. But the weight of the family, the pressure to take over my father's business, I had to give up that dream. I hoped Ethan would follow it for me, but he doesn't have an ounce of passion." I said quietly, "I don't think it's ever too late to chase a dream, sir." You're still a remarkable man, and you can do anything you set your mind to. He turned to look at me and smiled, a rare sight. You're the only one who seems to understand me. Those words were a kind of validation. I knew I now held a special place in his heart. Meanwhile, in front of Ethan, I continued to play the role of the patient, long-suffering wife. As I grew quieter and less jealous, he became more arrogant. He openly brought Vanessa home for dinner, introducing her to relatives as a close friend. Victoria showered Vanessa with praise, calling her capable and charming. It was as if I were invisible in my own home. Every dinner with Vanessa present was torture. She would sit next to Ethan, placing food on his plate, laughing and chatting intimately, occasionally shooting me a provocative look. I would just lower my head and eat, but under the table, my nails dug into my palms. The only one who showed any discomfort was my father-in-law. He would often put his fork down with a sharp clink, clear his throat, or change the subject to business, breaking the suffocating atmosphere. Every time he did, I felt his unspoken support. One weekend, the rest of the family went out, leaving just Richard and me at home. Victoria and Ethan had taken Vanessa to see a piece of property on the outskirts of the city, claiming it was for investment purposes. I knew it was just an excuse. As I was tidying up the study, Richard came in. He looked a bit tired. "Claire, could you make me a cup of ginger tea? I have a bit of a headache." "Of course, sir. Please have a seat." I hurried to the kitchen. When I returned with the tea, he was standing by the window looking out. "Does it bother you?" he asked suddenly. I knew he was asking about Ethan and Vanessa. I was silent for a moment before answering quietly. "What would change if it did? I suppose this is just my fate." "You make your own fate," he said, turning to step closer to me. "You are a smart, strong woman. You don't deserve this kind of treatment." He was standing very close. I could smell the faint masculine scent from him. This proximity was dangerous. I lowered my head, my voice choked. "But what can I do? I have no family connections, no money, and I can't have a child. Victoria and Ethan are right. I have nothing." I deliberately let a few tears escape. I felt his hand hesitate in the air, before it gently rested on my shoulder. His hand was warm and firm, giving me a strange sense of security. "Who said you have nothing? You have a wisdom and a sensitivity that few possess." He patted my shoulder lightly. "Don't cry. Everything will be all right." I lifted my head and looked him straight in the eye, my own eyes glistening with tears. "Sir, I'm just so tired. I wish I had someone to protect me." The words were both a lament and an invitation. I saw his Adam's apple move. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a father looking at his daughter-in-law. It was the look of a man looking at a woman filled with pity, respect, and a suppressed desire. He took a deep breath and slowly removed his hand. "Rest. I will deal with Ethan." He left the room hastily, as if fleeing from his own thoughts. I watched him go and smiled. He was completely caught in the trap I had laid. He wanted to protect me, to be my anchor. The wind was already blowing. All I needed now was a single spark to set this entire forest ablaze. My plan was halfway there. I had successfully forged a special bond with Richard Sterling. Now I needed one final push, an event so powerful it would shatter all his remaining reservations and turn the sinful thought in his head into action. And that opportunity came on a stormy night. Ethan and Victoria had gone to a friend's birthday party and were due back late. The vast mansion held only two people, my father-in-law and me. Outside, a tempest raged. Thunder and lightning tore through the sky, shaking the entire house. Suddenly, with a loud pop, all the lights went out, plunging the space into darkness. I heard Richard's voice from the study. "Claire, are you all right?" I knew. This was my moment. Pitch-black darkness swallowed the mansion with only the sound of rain lashing against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. I stood in the kitchen, calming my racing heart. This was it. This night, this storm, it was all a stage set for my plan. "I'm fine, sir. Stay where you are. I'll bring a candle." I tried to keep my voice from trembling. I fumbled in a drawer and found a few candles and a box of matches. As I lit one, the yellow flame danced across my face, casting eerie shadows on the wall. Holding the candlestick, I walked slowly toward Richard's study. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently and went inside. He was standing by the window, his large silhouette stark against the lightning-lit sky. He turned at the faint candlelight in my hand. "You found some. Good girl." His voice sounded a bit lighter. I placed the candle on his desk. As the light illuminated his face, I could read a hint of anxiety on his brow. "Are you afraid of the dark, sir?" I blurted out, then immediately felt I had been too forward. He let out a low chuckle. "Not so much afraid as I dislike the feeling of not being in control." I remained silent. I understood what he meant. He was a man accustomed to holding power his entire life, to having everything under his control. The darkness, the uncertainty, it made him uneasy. I brought a few more candles and placed them around the room, which gradually became brighter and cozier. We sat on the sofa. No one spoke. There was only the sound of the rain and the soft crackle of the burning wicks. The atmosphere was strangely suffocating. I knew I had to be the one to break the silence. "Sir," I began. "You're very disappointed in Ethan, aren't you?" My direct question made Richard pause. He looked at me, his sharp gaze seeming to pierce through to my soul. "Why do you ask that?" "I can just feel it." I didn't avoid his gaze, meeting it directly. "I can see the exhaustion in your eyes. You've been carrying everything for so long. You built a great empire, but your only heir gives you no peace of mind. I know your biggest worry isn't money, but the family lineage, the succession." Every word I spoke seemed to touch upon the deepest, most hidden corners of his heart. His stern expression slowly softened, replaced by a profound sadness. He didn't answer but let out a heavy sigh that said more than 1,000 words of admission. I stood up, went to the small bar in the corner of the room, and poured a glass of strong whiskey. I offered it to him. "Have a drink, warm yourself up. It's going to be a long night." He looked up at me, then at the glass. After a moment's hesitation, he took it and downed it in one go. The amber liquid seemed to wash away some of the tightness in his chest. He began to talk about the pressure, the expectations, and the loneliness no one could share. He said Victoria had never truly understood him, and that Ethan only knew how to tear down what he had built. Sometimes I ask myself what I'm working so hard for. Just to hand it all over to that worthless son of mine and watch him run it into the ground in a few years. His voice was hoarse with emotion. I sat down next to him, closer than before. "Don't say that, sir. Everything you've accomplished will never disappear. It just needs someone worthy to protect and grow it." "Someone worthy?" He laughed bitterly. "And where am I supposed to find someone like that in this family?" Just then, lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the room, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. I yelped in genuine surprise and reflexively leaned toward him, my entire body collapsing into his arms. My trembling was not entirely an act. I truly was afraid of thunder, but the fall was calculated. My soft, warm body pressed against his hard chest. The faint scent of my hair mixed with the strong smell of whiskey, creating a strange, intoxicating effect. Richard froze. His hands started to push me away, then stopped. Finally, slowly, his arms wrapped around me. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." His voice was low and rough, his warm breath tickling my ear. I could feel his heart pounding as fast as mine. I didn't lift my head but buried my face in his chest, still trembling. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's okay," he said, but his arms only held me tighter. We sat like that amidst the storm. The darkness and the faint candlelight were the perfect catalysts, dissolving all moral and ethical boundaries. I knew this was my final gamble. All or nothing. Slowly, I raised my head, my eyes still wet with tears, and looked directly into his. In the candlelight, his eyes were deep pools of complex emotions, pity, desire, and an internal struggle. "Sir," I whispered, my voice like silk. "What am I going to do now? I'm so lonely." I didn't need to say another word. My gaze, my voice, my trembling body in his arms said it all. Richard Sterling slowly lowered his head. The distance between our faces closed, and I could feel his hot breath on my skin. I closed my eyes. I knew what was about to happen. It was disgusting. It was a sin. It went against everything I had ever believed to be right. But it was also the only way to get my revenge. An image of Ethan and Vanessa flashed in my mind. Victoria's contemptuous smile, the burning pain on my cheek. The rage surged again, extinguishing the faint flicker of guilt in my heart. This was the price they had to pay. His lips met mine. It wasn't sweet or romantic. It was the brand of a sinful contract, the beginning of an irreversible tragedy. That night in the howling storm, I pushed myself into an abyss of sin. I offered my body as a sacrifice on the altar of my hatred. When the storm subsided, I knew that another far more terrible storm was about to form right inside this house. And the one who had lit the fuse was none other than me. The next morning when I woke up in my room, everything seemed to have returned to normal. But I knew some things had changed forever. The relationship between my father-in-law and me was no longer simple. It was a dark secret, an invisible shackle that bound us together. An odd silence fell between us in the days following that stormy night. We avoided each other's eyes when others were around. The conversations in the study ceased. But the silence wasn't born of distance. It was the suffocating, unspoken understanding of two people who shared a terrible secret. Richard avoided me, and every time I saw him, guilt and self-loathing churned in my stomach. What have I done? What kind of person have I become? The questions tormented me every night. But whenever I saw Ethan chatting affectionately with Vanessa in the living room or heard Victoria pointedly remark how so-and-so's daughter-in-law had already given birth to a beautiful son, hatred won once. Again. I'm not wrong, I told myself. This is the path they forced me onto. I had to keep going. I had to complete my plan. I needed a child. Richard Sterling's child. That was my sole objective, my ultimate weapon. But it wasn't easy. How could I get pregnant with my father-in-law's child without anyone suspecting I started pretending to mend my relationship with Ethan? I was no longer cold to him. I cooked his favorite meals and asked about his day. The simple-minded Ethan believed I had completely capitulated, that I had accepted his affair. He was triumphant. You should have known your place sooner, he told me while texting Vanessa. Just play the quiet little wife and I'll make sure you're taken care of. I just smiled. A fake submissive smile, but inside I was screaming. I needed Ethan's advances as the perfect cover. It would legitimize the child in my womb later on. At the same time, I had to find a way to approach my father-in-law again. His avoidance made me anxious. If he decided to end things, my plan would be ruined. I had to make sure he couldn't escape this swamp of sin. I knew his weaknesses were his loneliness and his desperate desire for a worthy heir. I decided to exploit them. One evening, knowing he was working late in his study, I brewed a calming tea and brought it to him. Sir, you've been working so late. I thought this might help you relax. As I placed the cup on his desk, I deliberately let my hand brush against his. He flinched and pulled his hand back, unable to look at me. Thank you. His voice was hoarse. I didn't leave right away. I stood there looking at a blueprint on his desk. Is this for the new downtown project? The rendering looks incredible. I struck up a conversation naturally. Richard had no choice but to respond. We started talking about work again, about the project. And I steered the conversation where I wanted it to go. I wish Ethan could help lighten your burden. He's smart, but I think he just hasn't fully committed to the business yet. I deliberately spoke well of Ethan, which surprised him. You don't resent him. What would resentment change? I sighed, playing the part of the magnanimous wife. I just wish he would grow up, take care of his family, and think about the future. I think having a child would probably change him. I mentioned the word again, child, a magic word for him. I saw his gaze darken. I hope so too. We're trying, I said in a sad voice. But I guess it's just not meant to be yet. I turned to leave, then paused as if a thought had just occurred to me. I turned back and looked him straight in the eye, whispering just loud enough for him to hear, or maybe I'm just not blessed enough to have one. My lingering words were pregnant with meaning. It was both a lament and a sinful proposition. I saw Richard's face flush. He shot up from his chair and paced the room. Don't think such nonsense. Go and get some rest. He rushed me out of the room, but I knew my words had planted a seed of guilt and a wild idea in his mind, an idea he probably didn't even want to admit to himself. He craved a grandson. Nominally, I was the only one in the family who could provide one. But between Ethan and me, there was no news of a child. That cruel reality, combined with the sin we had already committed, was pushing his thoughts in a different direction. A few days later, he summoned me to the study. This time, he didn't avoid me. He locked the door from the inside. Claire, he said, his voice terribly strained. I've done a lot of thinking. I held my breath, my heart pounding wildly. I know this is wrong, that it's an animalistic thing to do. But I cannot let this business fall into the hands of an outsider. I cannot let the Sterling line die out. I remained silent, waiting for him to say the words I most wanted to hear. He walked over and gripped my shoulders. His eyes were burning with a mixture of desire and desperation. Have my child. He had finally said it. I let out a breath of relief, but feigned shock. Sir, what are you saying? How could we? I'm Ethan's wife. No one will know. His voice was firm. When the child is born, he will bear the Sterling name and be the heir to this family. On paper, he will be Ethan's son, the sole inheritor. I will secure your future and the child's. You will never have to suffer again. Hearing his words, I felt a mix of disgust and exhilaration. For the sake of his business, he was willing to defy nature and morality. For the sake of my hatred, I was willing to use any means necessary. We were, in fact, the same kind of people. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, making him anxious. Finally, I gave a quiet nod, 2 tears rolling down my cheeks. I will do anything for this family, I said in a tragic voice. Richard pulled me into a fierce hug. I know. I will never forget this. From then on, our secret sinful relationship began right inside this house. I played the part of a virtuous wife next to Ethan, while stealing moments to be with my father-in-law. Each time I felt a part of me die, but the thought of revenge revived me. I carefully calculated my ovulation cycle and planned everything perfectly. And finally, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. One morning, 2 distinct lines appeared on a pregnancy test. I sat in the bathroom, trembling, holding the small plastic stick. I was pregnant. A life conceived of hatred and sin was growing inside me. It was a ticking time bomb, my devastating weapon. I tried to maintain my composure as I left the bathroom. I told Ethan the news first. He was stunned for a moment, then let out a whoop of joy. He hugged me and spun me around. My God, I'm going to be a father, Claire, you did it! He kissed my cheeks, my forehead. A false happiness he knew nothing about. I watched his ecstatic smile and smiled back. A victor's smile. He was celebrating his own shame, welcoming the birth of his own half-brother. There could be no sweeter revenge. The news of my pregnancy was like a welcome rain on the parched land of the Sterling family. Ethan's attitude changed completely. He treated me with utmost care, boasting to all his friends that he was going to be a father. Victoria maintained her cold exterior, but I could tell she was thrilled. She started preparing nutritious meals for me and brought home all sorts of expensive prenatal vitamins. You need to eat well to have a strong son to carry on the family name, she'd say. Still pragmatic, but at least I was no longer treated like a ghost. My status in the house had changed. I was no longer the barren wife, but the vessel carrying the family's greatest hope. The person who was happiest was probably my father-in-law, but his joy had to be completely hidden. He expressed his concern only through small gestures. He'd tell me to be careful when I walked or frown if he saw me eating too little. When we were alone, his gaze on my stomach was a complex mix of joy, worry, and guilt. You must take good care of yourself. If you need anything, don't hesitate to tell me, he said to me once, when we were alone in the study. I nodded quietly. I was enjoying this change, basking in the family's attention and care. I felt a supreme sense of pleasure watching Ethan run around buying snacks for me. He had no idea he was doting on his future arch-nemesis, his own half-brother. But those peaceful days didn't last long. When I was 3 months pregnant, a new storm hit. Ethan's mistress Vanessa announced that she was also pregnant. The news was a bomb dropped in the middle of our family's joy. It was Ethan who broke the news to everyone at the dinner table. He looked both happy and flustered. Vanessa's pregnant too, he said, unable to meet my eyes. The table fell silent. I was stunned, and the fork in my hand clattered onto my plate. Another pregnancy. How could the timing be so perfect? The first to react was my mother-in-law. Far from being angry, she seemed delighted. Is that so? That's wonderful. A double blessing, she exclaimed, her eyes gleaming. Then she glanced at me. Fortune must be smiling on our house. Now we'll just have to see which one of you is carrying our grandson. A chill ran down my spine. See which one is carrying our grandson. In her eyes, Vanessa and I were now 2 racehorses in a competition to produce a son. The winner would be the one who gave birth to a boy. The position I had just gained was once again on shaky ground. My father-in-law slammed his fork down. His face was grim. Nonsense. Ethan, you clean up this mess. Don't make this family a laughingstock. With that, he left the table and went to his room. I knew he was angry, but also afraid. Vanessa's pregnancy complicated our plan. If she had a son and I had a daughter, our child, his true bloodline, would be overshadowed by a fraud. From that day on, tension returned to the house. Victoria began to openly dote on Vanessa. She invited her to the house more often, cooking her elaborate meals. She treated Vanessa even better than she had treated me when I first became pregnant. Vanessa is craving sour foods. It must be a boy, she would say loudly at the dinner table, making sure I heard. Vanessa became insufferably smug. She strutted around the house like a queen, looking at me with a mixture of pity and provocation. She seemed to believe that as long as she had a son, she could march into this house and kick me out. Ethan was caught in the middle, torn between pleasing his mother and not angering his father. He couldn't treat me badly either, as I was carrying his son. He was a puppet, pulled in every direction. I maintained my composure on the outside, even pretending to be understanding. I understand how you feel, Ethan. What's done is done. You have to take responsibility for her and the baby. I played the part of the wise wife, but a storm was raging inside me. I could not lose this war. I had to have a son. I started seeing a doctor at a private clinic who could keep the baby's gender confidential. I told the family the doctor said it was too early to tell, but every checkup was filled with suffocating anxiety. It's a boy, Mrs. Sterling. A very healthy one. The doctor's words during my 6-week ultrasound felt like a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from my shoulders. A boy. My weapon was a powerful one, but I decided to keep this secret to myself. I wouldn't tell anyone, not even my father-in-law. I wanted to deliver a surprise, a final game-changing blow. I wanted to see the look on Victoria and Vanessa's faces when they thought I had lost. Meanwhile, Vanessa had her ultrasound and boasted to everyone that she was carrying a son. Victoria was ecstatic, as if she'd struck gold. She bought all sorts of expensive baby supplies for her unborn grandson, all in shades of blue. Convinced I was having a daughter, she treated me with growing indifference. Well, a girl is fine too. It's nice for the house to have a big sister and a little brother, she'd say to me, as if bestowing a great favor. I just smiled. Enjoy it while you can. Your laughter won't last long. Their contempt only strengthened my resolve. I quietly began to prepare for the final battle. I wanted them not just to lose, but to be utterly ruined. I started digging into Vanessa's work at the company. I asked a friend who worked in forensic accounting to review the projects she was managing. And I discovered something shocking. Vanessa, with Ethan's help, had been siphoning a significant amount of money from the company through shell corporations and ghost contracts. They were preparing an escape route in case things went south. I had the evidence in my hands. It felt like holding a bomb. I wouldn't detonate it now. I would wait. I would wait until the day my child was born. That day would not only be the day I gave birth to a new life, but also the day I brought ruin to all those who had scorned and trampled me. The real storm had yet to arrive. The months of pregnancy passed in a suffocating tension. The mansion had become a grand stage with Vanessa and me as the two leading ladies in a power struggle, and the rest of the family as a discerning audience ready to pass judgment at any moment. Victoria no longer hid her favoritism. She openly treated Vanessa as her future daughter-in-law, while I was treated like a surrogate, a guest in my own home. The best food, all the attention was lavished on Vanessa and the heir in her womb. Ethan was completely under Vanessa and his mother's control. He paraded her around openly, even taking her to company events and introducing her like his future wife. He seemed to have completely forgotten about me, his legal wife, who was carrying his child, at least on paper. I became a shadow in my own house. I often ate my meals alone in the kitchen, unwilling to watch them sit around the dining table like a happy family. The pain and humiliation grew daily, but they didn't break me. Instead, they became a wall of fire around my heart, forging me into something as cold and hard as steel. Endure, I told myself. The closer they push me to the cliff, the more powerful my counterattack will be. The only person in the house who cared for me was my father-in-law. Richard Sterling grew more distant from his wife and son. He often ate alone in his study, and his arguments with Victoria became more frequent. "You've been acting so strange lately," I overheard her snap at him. "Ethan is about to give us an heir, the whole family should be celebrating, yet you walk around with a long face. Don't tell me you feel sorry for that one." Richard would usually just roar back. "What do you know? Just you wait. This house is going to be in an uproar because of you and your son." He couldn't protect me openly. Doing so would risk exposing our terrible secret. That powerlessness turned to rage, which he unleashed on Ethan. He began to tighten his grip on the company's management, cutting off all of Ethan's unnecessary expenses. Unable to shower Vanessa with money, luxury goods, and expensive cars anymore, Ethan grew frustrated. "I don't know what's wrong with Dad lately. He's acting like a tyrant," he came to me one day. It was the first time in months he had lowered himself to ask me for something. "Can't you say something to him?" I looked at the man who was once my husband and felt a bitter taste in my mouth. He only sought me out when he needed something. I scoffed. "I'm just a woman living on your charity." How could I dare speak to him? "Why don't you ask Miss Thorne? She's so capable and has your mother's favor. Maybe she'd have better luck." My words were both sarcastic and provocative. Ethan stormed off in a rage. He was no longer the king of his own kingdom. The power and money he had always flaunted were being slowly stripped away by his father, and the one pulling the strings behind the scenes was me. I knew Richard was doing all this for me and the child in my womb. He was clearing a path for us. He wanted to weaken Ethan, to make him lose everything, so that when the truth came out, he would have no power left to resist. My relationship with Richard became a secret alliance. We didn't need words. A single glance was enough. Sometimes he would leave small notes for me in the study. Going to Boston for the weekend. Taking Ethan. Take care of yourself at home. Or, there's a problem with Vanessa's project. It's under investigation. You just focus on the baby. Those notes were my only comfort in those dark days. I knew I wasn't alone in this war. I had the most powerful ally. Meanwhile, I continued to gather evidence of Ethan and Vanessa's embezzlement. My accountant friend found enough dirt to send them both to prison for a very long time. I copied all the files and stored them in a safe place. My bomb was growing bigger every day, its destructive potential more terrifying. My due date and Vanessa's were about 2 weeks apart. I went into labor first. The whole family scrambled to get me to the hospital, an expensive private facility my father-in-law had personally arranged. Victoria and Ethan looked surprised but didn't dare defy him. In the waiting room, it was just Ethan and Victoria. They sat with indifferent expressions, occasionally glancing at their phones. They were there out of a sense of duty and for appearances. I knew they were secretly hoping I would have a daughter, giving them the perfect excuse to bring Vanessa into the family. My father-in-law didn't come. He said he had urgent business. But I knew he was somewhere nearby waiting for news, more anxious than any of us. After hours of agonizing labor, a baby's cry finally filled the room. A nurse came out and smiled at Ethan. Congratulations. It's a beautiful, healthy, 8-pound baby boy. I saw Ethan's face freeze, his smile forced. Victoria stood, rooted to the spot, dropping her handbag. A boy, she stammered. Yes, a little prince, the nurse confirmed cheerfully. I was wheeled out of the delivery room, exhausted but utterly triumphant. I had won. I had a son. Seeing the stunned, devastated looks on their faces, I felt that all my suffering had been worth it. Ethan came to my bedside and looked at the baby sleeping in my arms. He forced another smile. He looks a lot like you. I smiled back a meaningful smile. He may look like me, but he's a true blessing for the Sterling family, isn't he, honey? Just then, Victoria's phone rang. It was Vanessa. I could faintly hear her screaming through the receiver. She must have heard the news. The race was over before she had even reached the finish line. Victoria hung up her face ashen. She walked out of the room without a word. I knew her mind was in turmoil. Her plans to make Vanessa her daughter-in-law, to welcome Vanessa's son as the heir, all of it had turned to dust. I had blocked all their paths. But this was just the prelude. The biggest bomb had yet to explode. When my son and I returned home from the hospital, my father-in-law had transformed my room into a baby's paradise. He held his grandson in his arms, an undeniable happiness on his usually stoic face. He looked at the baby, then at me, his eyes full of gratitude. "You've been through a lot," was all he said, but I understood everything. Ethan tried to play the part of a doting father, but his awkwardness was palpable. He held the baby clumsily, looking at him with the eyes of a stranger. Perhaps on a subconscious level, he sensed something was wrong. 2 weeks later, Vanessa also gave birth. She had a daughter. The news was the final blow, completely crushing all of Victoria and Ethan's remaining hopes. My son was now the one and only heir, the undisputed successor to the Sterling fortune. The war seemed to be over, but I knew that a cornered beast is the most dangerous. And I was waiting for their final desperate act. The birth of my son, the sole male heir, completely changed the power dynamics in the house. From a neglected wife and scorned daughter-in-law, I instantly became the most powerful woman in the family after my father-in-law. Victoria, though resentful, could not show it. My son was the family's treasure, the key to inheriting a vast fortune. She couldn't afford to ignore me. Ethan continued to live in a daze. He tried to be a father, but the bond between him and the baby was faint. He had no idea that every time he held the child, he was holding his own half-brother, the living embodiment of betrayal and hatred. After giving birth to a daughter, Vanessa lost all her power. Ethan no longer gave her money as he used to, and Victoria lost all interest in her and her child. The once prospective mistress of the house was now an abandoned single mother. Bitterness and rage would not let her rest. She began to act erratically. She called and texted Ethan constantly, sometimes crying, sometimes threatening. "You have to take responsibility for us. If you don't, I'll tell the world what a monster you really are." I overheard her screaming over the phone as I passed Ethan's room. But Ethan was no longer afraid. "What can you do? Your baby is a girl, and my wife gave me a son." "Do you have any idea what my position is now?" he replied callously. Ethan's coldness pushed Vanessa over the edge. She started sending me photos of them together, along with provocative messages. You think you've won. A man who cheats once will cheat again. Have fun clutching your son and living in fear for the rest of your life. I looked at the messages, smiled, and deleted them. There was no jealousy anymore, only pity for her. She had lost, but refused to admit it. But I underestimated the madness of a woman pushed to the brink. One afternoon, as I was putting my son down for a nap, Vanessa showed up at our front door. She looked haggard and exhausted, but her eyes burned with the fire of hatred. I need to talk to you, she said in a raspy voice. I tried to close the door, not wanting to cause a scene, but she pushed her way in with all her might. You think you've won just because you had a son. You think you can keep my man forever, she screamed, lunging at me. I quickly clutched my son and stumbled backward. Startled by the commotion, the baby burst into tears. Hearing the crying, Victoria and Ethan rushed downstairs. Seeing the scene, Ethan hurried to pull Vanessa away. Are you crazy? What are you doing here? Me, crazy! Yes, I am crazy, Vanessa struggled, pointing a finger straight at me. It's all because of her. She took you. She took everything from me. Victoria, distressed by her grandson's crying, moved to take the baby, but I held him tight, not letting anyone touch him. In the midst of the chaos, my father-in-law came home from work. Seeing the pandemonium, his face hardened. Everybody, stop. His thunderous command silenced the house instantly, leaving only the sound of my son's cries. Richard Sterling walked in. His icy gaze swept over Ethan, Vanessa, and Victoria. Finally, his eyes rested on Vanessa. And who are you to cause a disturbance in my house? I'm Vanessa, the mother of Ethan's child. She stammered, her earlier bravado gone, replaced by fear. Ethan's child, Richard, sneered. And do you have any idea what the father of your child has been doing behind your back? He threw a thick file onto the coffee table. This is the proof that you and Ethan conspired to embezzle millions of dollars from the company. With this, you could both rot in prison for a very long time. Ethan and Vanessa's faces turned white as sheets. Dad, how did you know? Ethan trembled. How did I know Richard cut him off? If I hadn't, you two would have cleaned me out and run off, wouldn't you? Victoria was stunned. She looked at her son, then at the file. Ethan, is this true? Ethan hung his head silent. Vanessa collapsed to the floor, sobbing and begging. Sir, I'm so sorry. Ethan made me do it. I didn't know anything. Didn't know anything. A cold voice cut through the air. It was mine. The moment I had been waiting for. I handed my son to the housekeeper to take upstairs and pulled out a small digital recorder. Then, how do you explain this recording? I pressed play. Vanessa and Ethan's voices filled the room crisp and clear. They were discussing how to create fake contracts, how to wire the money overseas. We have to hurry before the old man gets suspicious, Ethan's voice said. Don't worry, babe. I've handled all the paperwork. Once I have our son, your mother will be on our side. Then all this will be ours, Vanessa's voice replied. When the recording ended, a deathly silence descended on the room. Everyone stared at me in shock. They could never have imagined that the quiet, submissive woman they knew could orchestrate something like this. Victoria stumbled and sank into a chair. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hatred and fear. You planned all of this. I just sneered. Compared to what you and Ethan did to me, a little planning is nothing. Ethan looked at me as if I were a monster. You venomous bitch, I'll kill you, he roared, trying to lunge at me. Stop, Richard bellowed. If you lay one hand on her, I'll have you in jail by morning. Ethan froze. He looked at his father, then back at me. He knew he had lost. Utterly. He had lost his money, his lover, and now his father's trust. He had lost everything. As of today, Richard announced in a resolute voice, Ethan is suspended from all duties at the company. All of his accounts and credit cards are frozen. You will live in this house like a parasite until you learn to repent. Then he turned to Vanessa. And you. Get out of here now. Considering you just had a baby, I won't press charges. But don't ever let me see you again. Vanessa scrambled to her feet, weeping, and ran out of the house. The chessboard seemed to be cleared. I had turned the tables and made those who wronged me pay. I looked at Ethan, frozen in place, and Victoria crying silently. In my heart, there was no joy of victory, only a terrifying emptiness. I had succeeded in my revenge, but I had also become a demon. And a demon's tears are never seen. But I knew a more terrible truth. A larger time bomb was still hidden, and the day of its detonation was fast approaching. After the shocking revelation, a deathly silence fell over the mansion. Stripped of all power, Ethan became a wandering shadow in the house. He spoke to no one, holing up in his room all day with only the occasional sound of something breaking or a muffled scream. Victoria completely fell apart. The shock of her son's incompetence and greed, combined with the true nature of the daughter-in-law she had always dismissed, broke her pride. She took to her bed, refusing to eat. The once vibrant house now felt like a mausoleum. I became the one who managed everything. I took care of my son, administered Victoria's medication, and oversaw the family's meals and daily life. I did it not out of kindness, but to show them that I was now the master of this game. I wanted them to depend on me to live every day in regret and guilt. My father-in-law Richard was my only pillar of support, but the relationship between us was bizarre. We were allies, co-conspirators, sharing the same secret, but also two sinners in a tragedy of incest. In front of others, he was the dignified patriarch, and I was the dutiful daughter-in-law. But when we were alone, the air was thick with tension. We couldn't look each other in the eye. Our son was our only connection, and at the same time, our greatest obstacle. Every time Richard held the baby, I could see the conflict in his eyes. He loved the child. That was clear. The boy was his blood, his hope. But he could never call him son, never acknowledge him publicly. He could only love him under the guise of grandfather. "He's starting to look more like you as he gets older," he said to me once, a rare comment. I was startled. "Like me?" "Yes. He has your stubborn, resilient spirit," he said, staring into the distance. I knew he was looking for comfort, for a way to rationalize his sin. The child looked nothing like me. As he grew, his features became more defined, and he was the spitting image of his grandfather. The high forehead, the straight nose, and especially the deep, soulful eyes. Anyone who saw him would think he was a miniature Richard Sterling. This fact began to frighten me. How much longer could we hide this secret? Victoria was bedridden, but a mother's eyes are still sharp. One day, when I brought my son to see her, she stared intently at the baby's face. Why does he look so familiar?" she whispered. I felt a jolt of fear and quickly changed the subject. "He's your grandson. Of course he looks familiar to you." But I knew the seed of doubt had been planted in her mind. As the days went by, that doubt grew. She began to watch my interactions with Richard. She saw how unusually attentive he was to the baby, how we sometimes exchanged meaningful glances. And then the event that blew everything apart happened. It was the day of my son's first birthday. Richard decided to throw a grand party, inviting all our relatives, friends, and important business partners. He wanted to officially announce the arrival of the sole heir to the Sterling Group to the world. The party was magnificent. I stood next to Richard, holding my beautifully dressed son, greeting the guests. I felt like a queen, all eyes on us, a mixture of envy and jealousy. Ethan was there, but he stood alone in a corner, drinking and glaring at us with rage-filled eyes. At the height of the party, as Richard stood on the stage, holding his grandson proudly giving a speech, Victoria suddenly appeared. She had recovered some of her health but still looked frail. She walked onto the stage and snatched the microphone from Richard's hand. "Just a moment." Her voice trembled but was loud enough to silence the entire ballroom. "Before we all celebrate, there's something I need to make clear." Everyone was bewildered. Richard frowned. "What do you think you're doing? Get down from there." "No, Victoria," cried, tears streaming down her face. "The truth has to come out. This child, is he really Ethan's son?" A murmur went through the crowd. Ethan, his face pale, shot to his feet. I froze, my heart stopping. How did she know? Richard tried to take the microphone back. "Have you lost your mind? Stop this nonsense." "I'm not crazy," Victoria shoved him away. "Open your eyes and look. Look closely at this child's face. Does he look anything like Ethan? Is there a single feature? Or does he look exactly like someone else?" She pointed a trembling finger at Richard's face. "He looks exactly like you, my husband." A horrifying silence fell over the ballroom. All eyes darted between Richard, me, and the bewildered baby in my arms. "Yesterday, I secretly took a sample of your hair and the baby's hair and sent it for a DNA test," Victoria sobbed. "And I have the results right here." She held up a piece of paper. "According to this, you two are a 99.9% match for a father-son relationship." The biggest bomb of all had detonated. It destroyed not just the party, but the reputation and lives of everyone present. Everything shattered. I heard the sound of glasses breaking, the gasps and whispers of the crowd, the relentless flashes of cameras. Richard stood frozen, his face drained of all color. Ethan let out a wounded, animalistic howl. He stormed the stage, his eyes wild. No, it can't be true. Tell me. Say it's not true, he screamed, grabbing me by the collar and shaking me violently. I didn't resist. I just looked at him. My eyes were the only answer he needed. He let go of me and stumbled back. He looked at the father he had both respected and feared. Dad, why? Why would you do this to me? Richard didn't answer. He just stood there like a statue. The king of the Sterling Empire was now naked before the world. Victoria began to laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. Ha, a happy family, the heir. It was all a show. A filthy, disgusting show. She laughed until she cried, then collapsed onto the stage. Our family had become the laughingstock of the world overnight. My revenge was complete. Utterly, perfectly complete. I had destroyed everything. But as I looked at the chaos before me, at my young son screaming in terror, I asked myself, what have I gained? I had won. But was the price of this victory not far too high? The fateful night of the first birthday party left a scar on the Sterling family history that would never heal. Newspapers, television, social media, they all feasted on the story. Sensational headlines, sharp analyses, and vicious comments rained down on us. Tragedy of a tycoon, father and son share one woman. Heir or brother, the incest scandal that toppled an empire. We went from being a respected dynasty to a symbol of disgrace, a joke for the entire society. No one could go back to the way things were. Victoria suffered a heart attack and was rushed to the emergency room. She survived, but her spirit was broken. She lost her ability to speak her laughter and became a hollow shell staring silently out the window. The once proud, sharp woman was now a frail, pitiful old lady. Ethan, after his crazed outburst, collapsed completely. He no longer screamed or broke things. He became terrifyingly quiet, locking himself in his room and refusing to see anyone. A week later, the housekeeper found him in the bathroom after a suicide attempt. He was found in time to save his life, but the trauma left his mind shattered. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. The man who had betrayed and trampled me was now paying a terrible price for his sins. I felt no satisfaction, only a cold, hollow emptiness. And Richard Sterling, once the most powerful man, aged a decade overnight. The company's stock plummeted and partners canceled contracts one after another. The empire he had spent a lifetime building was on the verge of collapse. He stopped going to the office, sitting alone in his study with bottles of strong liquor. He never once blamed me. Perhaps he knew he had no right to. This tragedy was of his own making. One evening he called me to his room. He sat amidst a mess of empty bottles, his face gaunt. "It's all my fault," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was too obsessed with having an heir, too selfish. I ended up tearing this family apart." He handed me a file. "This is all that's left of my personal fortune. I've transferred everything into your name and the boys. Take it, take our son and leave this place. Go somewhere far away and start a new life. He shouldn't have to grow up in the shadow of this shame." I looked at the file, then back at him. "And you." "I'll stay here." His eyes were empty. "I have to bear the weight of what I've done. This is my punishment." I didn't take the file. I just turned away silently. I knew that money had no meaning now. What we had all lost was something no amount of money could ever buy back. I had succeeded in my revenge. I had made everyone who hurt me suffer. But so what? I too was living in a hell of my own making. Every time I looked at my son, I saw Richard, and I was reminded of my sin. The child was innocent, but he would have to carry this stigma for the rest of his life. I decided to leave. I took nothing that belonged to the Sterling family. With only my son, I boarded a bus to my parents' quiet hometown, to a small house with a little garden. I wanted my child to grow up in a peaceful place, away from the sins and storms of the adults. The first few years were hard. I had to face the whispers and curious stares of the neighbors. But I didn't care. I devoted all my time to raising my son, tending the garden, and finding a semblance of peace. My son grew up healthy and kind. He was my reason for living, the only strength that kept me going. Occasionally, I would hear news of the Sterling family. Richard's group eventually went bankrupt. The mansion was sold to pay off debts, and he moved into a small apartment living as a recluse. Victoria was discharged and lived with him, an old couple taking care of each other. Ethan was still in the hospital, with no signs of improvement. The once glittering family was now nothing but ashes. Years later, around the time my son started school, I received a letter. It was in Richard's old, trembling handwriting. There wasn't much in it. He just asked if we were well, and said that he and his wife now frequented a church praying for us. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "If there is a next life, I pray we never meet again." I finished the letter and cried tears I didn't know I still had. The hatred was gone, replaced by a deep sorrow for our tangled, broken lives. My revenge was a success, but it had destroyed everyone, including myself. I had won the battle but lost the entire war. Watching my son playing happily in the yard, I made a promise to myself. I would dedicate the rest of my life to him, teaching him to be a good person, to live a life that would not repeat the mistakes of the previous generation. Even on a pile of ashes, the dawn will eventually come.